Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this fourth installment of our education webinars. And it is such a delight to have this awesome panel with us today. It is a very crucial topic that we are going to discuss today. My name is Tarek Khalil. I'm the education coordinator for the American Muslims for Palestine. And today's education webinar is titled Anti-Zionism versus Anti-Semitism. This is a crucial topic because it pervades our media today. Before I get into just a brief intro, I want to welcome our phenomenal powerhouse panel, and then we will begin. We have with us today Estee Chandler, who is a member of the Jewish Voice for Peace Board of Directors and chair of the Board of Directors for JVP's sister organization, JVP Action. In 2010, Estee Chandler founded the Los Angeles chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace, a national organization promoting solutions based on human rights and international law for both Palestinians and Jewish Israelis that work in broad coalition and other like-minded organizations. Along with Negwa Ibrahim, she is the host and producer of KPFK's Middle East in Focus and will launch a new podcast called The Breakout Room. I can't wait for that, which will focus on details of events overlooked in today's atmosphere of a constant cacophony of news. We also have with us Rabbi Brant Rosen, who is the founding rabbi of Tzedek, Chicago, and the co-founder of the Jewish Voice for Peace Rabbinical Council. He has previously served as the Midwest Regional Director for American Friends Service Committee, and I always see him at many events that I go to as well. And our very own, last but not least, we have Raed Jarrar, who is AMP's Advocacy Director. He is a Palestinian American blogger and political advocate based in the DC area. He has worked as a lobbyist on political issues pertaining to Palestine and US engagement in the Arab and Muslim worlds. He's widely recognized as an expert on political, social, and economic developments in the Middle East. He has testified in numerous congressional hearings and briefings, led national advocacy days in Washington, D.C., and is a frequent guest on national and international media outlets in both Arabic and English. Shalom, salam. Thank you all for being with us here today.
Thank you, Tarek.
Now, thank you. Absolutely. It's my honor. The topic, anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism. Now, the conflation of these terms create a lot of confusion. That's pretty much the main reason why I want to devote a whole session to this. That confusion results in vehement and almost always unwarranted attacks against students, organizations, and also politicians, as we've seen especially with Representative Ilhan Omar. Zionism, very simply, is a nationalist, settler-colonial project premised on the conquest of land and the dispossession of its indigenous population. Opposition to that is simply anti-Zionism. However, that correct understanding and definitional standard has been misused and abused, and for the most part has been omitted from our political discourse. I must say this at the outset, that anti-Semitism, bigotry against the Jewish people, hatred against the Jewish people is real, it exists, it must be condemned, and one of our jobs is to make sure that we fight anti-Semitism just as we should be fighting black racism, just as we should be fighting against all types of bigotry, xenophobia, racism, etc. The goal of this session, the goal of this webinar, is to highlight the distinctions between anti-Zionism, which is an ideology, a settler-colonial ideology, and anti-Semitism, which is hatred against the people because of who they are. And that's the critical distinction that must be made. I want to go to my guests, and I want them to really give their perspective on the distinctions between both. What do you think is, or what do you think are the distinctions between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism? We'll start with Estee.
Sure. I want to thank you, Tarek and AMP, for putting on this panel. I agree that it's a very, very important topic. I think that there are reasons why people are confused about these things, and So we have to try to straighten that out every opportunity we get. Obviously, anti-Semitism is pretty straightforward. It's anti-Jewish bigotry. Like you said, the same as bigotry toward any other particular person or race or religion for their identity. Zionism, and I'm going to speak specifically about political Zionism, which is a form of Jewish nationalism, and it's the primary ideology that drove the establishment of Israel. The movement was founded by 19th century thinker Theodor Herzl, and it saw the Jewish problems, quote unquote Jewish problem in Europe, as having a solution in a Jewish state. So political Zionism resulted in the establishment of a Jewish nation state in the land of historic Palestine, expelling about approximately 750,000 Palestinians in the process and confiscating their homes and properties. In spite of recognition of their rights by the UN, the rights to return and to be compensated continue to be denied by the US and Israel. Further, in 1967, Israel occupied the lands now known as the quote unquote occupied Palestinian territories, putting millions of people under military rule. So anti-Zionism is the rejection of these longstanding systemic inequalities that privilege Jews over Palestine inside Israel and the Palestinian occupied territories.
Thank you so much for that, Estee. Thank you for that perspective. And before we get into kind of more of an informal discussion here, I want to go to Rabbi Brant Rosen for his take on this and what he would like to add.
Thank you. And thank you, Tarek. And I'm delighted and honored to be part of this panel. I agree, as Estee mentioned, as you mentioned, that this is an enormously important and critical issue for us to be discussing. I'll underline a few things that Estee said and maybe amplify others. When we're talking about the difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, I think we need to look to sort of flip those coins and look at what is Judaism and what is Zionism. Judaism is a world religion, thousands of years old, that was born in the diaspora and takes its place alongside other faith traditions, as we know. Zionism, as Estee mentioned, is a political ideology when we're talking about political Zionism. And yes, it's true that in its origins, there were other forms of Zionism that were not rooted in the notion of a political nation state. But political Zionism, the kind of Zionism that was embodied by Theodor Herzl, as Estee mentioned, and the foundation of the Zionist movement, was predicated, it was a 19th century political movement that was predicated on a Jewish nation state in historic Palestine. It's also important to note that when Zionism began, it was considered a very controversial movement in the Jewish community. In fact, most Jews around the world were anti-Zionists. Most notably, the Reform movement, the largest American denomination, was very avowedly anti-Zionist because they believed that Judaism should be practiced around the world and as a universalistic religious spiritual ideology. And that Zionism, in a sense, was going back to a more tribal, pre-Jewish form of religion. It was not progressive. It was not understood to be a progressive forward-thinking movement. So the tradition of Jewish anti-Zionism is venerable. And goes back as long as there's been political Zionists. That's I think, a very, very important thing to note. After the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, as Estee mentioned, in the process displacing 750,000 Palestinians from their homes, and I would say necessarily, because Tarek, as you mentioned, this is a settler-colonial movement. All right, in order to create a Jewish state, there needed to be a demographic Jewish majority there. When the Zionist movement was founded, Jews were a tiny minority in historic Palestine. So in order to create a Jewish nation state, there needed to be a majority of Jews living there. There's no other way to achieve that other than literally engaging in ethnic cleansing. That is racist. That is inherently a racist enterprise. When you predicate the identity of one country exclusively on the identity of a specific people, that makes the presence of people who don't share that identity to be a problem to be dealt with. So those of us in the Jewish community who consider ourselves anti-Zionist are doing this out of a strong sense of Jewish imperative. It is my Judaism that I would say the most sacred values of my faith tradition that compel me to be anti-Zionist. Now, there are many political reasons currently why this conflation is happening, and we can talk about that later. But I want to state at the outset that it's very, very important that the world knows that anti-Zionism has a deep tradition in the Jewish community that continues even to this day.
No, that's absolutely well put, and I appreciate you highlighting that the historical context behind the terminology and how it has manifested itself in the way that it has today. Brother Raed, Jarrar, what do you think is the major distinction between these two terms and why it's been so misused, especially in our current political discourse?
Thank you, Tarek, for moderating the session, and I really feel happy to be sitting on the same panel with two dear friends and people who I respect and look up to in our fight for justice in Palestine. I do agree that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are very distinct ideas, very distinct, very different kinds of political positions. And many of the people who conflate anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism do it because of a political agenda that is meant to silence criticism of Israel. So, as everyone else mentioned before me, anti-Semitism is real, and it is a problem that we all have to fight against. It's not just an issue that members of the Jewish American community are responsible for fighting against. It's also our responsibility as Muslims, Christians, seculars, any other faiths to also fight against anti-Semitism the same way that we expect as Muslims, we expect others to step in and fight against Islamophobia. I think Jewish Voice for Peace, other Jewish-led organizations have given us all a really great standard and example of how they stood up as a Jewish organization to say no to Islamophobia. In the same way, many organizations, including AMP, has taken very strong stands in the past. We continue to do this on our individual capacities or organizational capacity to say no to anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism, on the other hand, is criticism of a political ideology. Not all Zionists happen to be Jewish. There are many Zionists who are Christian. There is actually a very strong, vibrant Christian Zionist movement in the United States, other parts around the world. There are even Muslims who are Zionists. So attempting to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism it comes from people who understand the difference between the two. I will actually take it one step further. These same people who conflate anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism also drop accusations of anti-Semitism against almost everyone who criticizes the state of Israel. So you don't even have to go as far as having an ideological stand against Zionism. You can just be someone who says, no, Israel has committed crimes against Palestinians in Gaza, or this Israeli policy is doing this, or U.S. support to this Israeli policy is against U.S. and international law, and many of the same powers who try to conflate anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism step in to criticize, to accuse people who have any kind of criticism to Israel, the state of Israel, or the actions of Israel as anti-Semitic. So the point that I want to make here in my opening statement is that these conflations are meant to silence very legitimate criticisms of the state of Israel, very legitimate political stands to criticize and oppose Zionism. And in a way, I feel that these political agendas that use the term anti-Semitism incorrectly, they end up making our legitimate fight against anti-Semitism harder, because they make the word cheaper and they throw it around all the time. And then when we get to a point where we actually are dealing with anti-Semitic voices in the United States, the term is losing its value because of how much it's being used around by political figures who just want to misuse the term for their own agenda. So let me stop here. I'm sure we're going to get into other details of this larger issue in the rest of this panel.
Yes, Raed, thank you very much for that. One thing that I notice a lot when we're dealing with the term anti-Semitism is that I fear that because of the way it's being misused, that we will, as you've pointed out, Raed, that we will overlook real anti-Semitism, which is something that we should combat, which is something that we should condemn, and that's not good for those that are against oppression and want to fight for people's human rights, so on and so forth. So one of the most virulent attacks against activists with respect to the term anti-Semitism is in the context of BDS activism. So when you have students that are advocating for the fundamental rights of the Palestinian people, which is what BDS really is fighting for. The three main demands of BDS is ending the occupation, it's equality for all, and it's implementation of the right of return. These are basic, mainstream, minimalist demands guaranteed under international law. But if you advocate for that, you are anti-Semitic. So whoever wants to tackle this, and I'll have others piggyback off that. Why do you think anti-Semitism, and it's sort of sticking in some media circles, those that advocate BDS are considered anti-Semitic, even though you're just pretty much advocating for fundamental human rights? Can you explain that phenomenon for me?
Well, I could make a first foray. I think I share your concern, and I also share your characterization of the BDS movement as someone who supports the Palestinian civil society call for BDS. What we're finding is that Israel advocates and Zionist advocates are using BDS as a focal point and attacking BDS by the claim that it is creating a double standard. You hear this a great deal, the double standard that Israel is held to, that is somehow anti-Semitic, that there are so many, why are we boycotting or calling for boycott or sanctioning of Israel and not these other horrible regimes around the world? That is holding Israel to a higher standard. And of course, that is a complete mischaracterization of what the BDS movement is. The BDS movement is a call from Palestinians, from Palestinian civil society, the overwhelming majority of Palestinian civil society, for solidarity, for basic essential human rights. So it's not, the essential question is not what about all these other countries? The essential question is, will we support the Palestinians in their call for solidarity or not? Now, I happen to think that the whole claim of a double standard is problematic on its face. Holding Israel to a double standard and saying that is somehow anti-Semitic is hugely problematic. And I think we've been seeing the increase in this rhetoric because of a specific definition of anti-Semitism that is beginning to make the rounds politically in this country, in the United States, and around the world. And that is a definition of anti-Semitism that was developed by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA, that has a whole list. They came up with a working definition of what they consider to be anti-Semitic. And one of those bullet points that they mention is applying double standards by requiring of it a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. And that is hugely problematic. It's actually quite preposterous. You can criticize the use of double standards, but the bottom line is people use double standards all the time when they're debating policy without being defined as bigoted or racist or anti-Semitic. So on its face, the claim of holding Israel to a double standard as somehow anti-Semitic is conflating the two to the point that the distinction becomes almost meaningless. And we can talk more about the IHRA definition, but I think it's enormously dangerous in the weaponization of anti-Zionism to silence Palestinians and Palestine solidarity activists, particularly on college campuses and BDS campaigns there and around the world.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Brant. And on that point of double standards, essentially the State Department has pretty much embraced that working definition, and also embraced what has become known infamously as the 3Ds: the demonization of Israel, the delegitimization of Israel, and applying that double standard. Estee, do you want to add to that?
Sure. So actually the U.S. State Department has used a working definition along with examples of anti-Semitism since 2010. It was in 2016 that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA, definition came into play or was adopted by the 31 member states of that body, and of which the United States is one of them. And so it builds upon what was already contained in the State Department definition. Brant, brought up this double standard thing, which is something that I've actually been thinking about a lot lately, because as he was alluding, there is a double standard, but it's the exact opposite of what Israel or the Israel lobby or supporters of the status quo in Israel claim. It's not that Israel gets held to higher standards. It's that international norms, legal norms of, when we give aid to countries, the kind of information that needs to be supplied, Israel is simply allowed not to comply, and therefore instances can't be tracked and they can't be held accountable. So I think that we need to bring up the double standard more and point out more this idea that while Israel's claiming that they're being treated by a higher standard, that they're actually, it's laughable, as Brant alluded, because it's exactly the opposite that's true. And this idea of trying to tack on, these criticisms of Israel in any way is a double standard in saying that Israel can't be like every other country where we can criticize the actions of the government and the laws of the government without, as free speech. So I think we actually need to really, really highlight this double standard issue and make sure that that double standard is erased.
Could I add one more thing just very quickly?
Yeah, please.
And this is to underline something that you said, Tarek. Anti-Semitism is real. It is very, very real right now, and we're seeing an uptick in it with the surge of white supremacy in this country and around the world. And anti-Semitism at its core is rooted in racial anti-Semitism is rooted in white supremacy. So this political debate over anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, using it and to weaponize it against Palestinians and those who support Palestinians, is in many ways, and as a Jew, I find that very harmful, because it's taking attention away. It's drawing resources and very, very important spotlight away from real anti-Semitism and focusing it into a place where there's no anti-Semitism at all. And in fact, that label is being used in a very cynical way, a cynical political way. So I would argue that we need to be finding security and solidarity, as we've all been saying, that anti-Semitism and anti-racism and anti-Islamophobia, this is all part of the same common cause. And anything that distracts us from that is dangerous to all of us.
I actually want to add something as well, Tarek. And I really like the points that were made by Estee and Brant, especially the point pertaining to double standards. Because Estee points out an extremely important fact, that we do fight double standards here in DC, because double standards are to give Israel, a blank check to violate laws, while we are holding other nations to a higher standard. So I do agree with Estee that there is a double standard in DC. It's ironically the other way around. There is a narrative out there, a narrative rooted in like whataboutism, a narrative that says that if you criticize Israel, you're singling out Israel. So I hear that all the time. Like, we talk about Israeli war crimes in Gaza, and then you hear voices online and offline saying, what about Assad? What about Saudi Arabia and Yemen? Or what about Egypt? My answer is always, yes, they are also criminals like you. Assad is also a criminal who is killing his own people. And Sisi is also committing violations of using U.S. weapons and aid, and we are working to hold him accountable. And Saudi Arabia is also committing crimes in Yemen that we are working to hold accountable. So this whataboutism is a fake way to deflect and to not deal with the actual charges of violations against Israel. The one thing I want to add is that throughout my work in Washington, D.C. in the last 15 years, most of our work here in Washington, D.C. is not to pick on anyone. Most of it is to hold all countries to one standard. And I remember our larger campaigns that included Israel also included countries like Egypt, that is the second largest recipient of U.S. military financing, FMF in the Middle East. We would like the United States government to hold Israel, Egypt, and other countries that receive our tax dollars to the same standard. The United States does not. Believe it or not, all the crimes that have been committed by Israel using US dollars, all of the crimes that we have documented over the last decades, the United States have not suspended military aid from a single Israeli soldier, not one soldier, not one. Like all of the violations, all of the extrajudicial killings, all of the torture incidents, all of the incidents that we have been documenting for decades, not one Israeli soldier has been held accountable by the US government. The US did suspend military aid to thousands of units around the world in the last few decades because of gross violations of human rights. Israel has been an exception. So speak about double standards. Not a single Israeli soldier suspended. Israel can get away literally with murder. And we're trying to hold Israel and Egypt and other recipients of US military aid, for example, to the same standard, and that is not being respected by the US government. So the comment that I'm making is that when it comes to these accusations of double standards, they're not just laughable, they're not just ironically the opposite. All of our work is exactly the opposite. All of our work is to actually hold Israel and other countries to the same standard and criticize all abusers of human rights to the same extent, regardless of their ethnicity or religious background.
Thank you so much for that, Raed. You know, it's interesting. Every single year, the UN has resolutions in the General Assembly condemning settlements, condemning Israeli violations, so on and so forth. So Zionists love to use that, play on that, to invoke that double standard argument by saying, no other country is being condemned the way Israel is. The size of El Salvador, the only country in the world that is barely the size of New Jersey, is getting hit with all these resolutions. No other country is experiencing that because they're not being held accountable. So these resolutions persist because Israel is is violating the rights of Palestinians with impunity. So that's why you have this constant movement towards condemnation, towards trying to push for change in policy, so on and so forth. So I mean, and I'm glad that we actually spent some time on the double standard argument, which kind of relates to the other two Ds, demonization and delegitimization as well. Raed, really quick, in what ways have you seen advocates for Palestinian rights inadvertently tap into anti-Semitic tropes in their speech, in their actions, and so forth?
It happens. I've seen it happen. I've seen activists make mistakes on purpose or make mistakes not knowing that they are repeating anti-Semitic tropes. And as a non-Jewish American, as a Muslim American, I have taken, in many examples, taken the initiative to reach out to people to give them the benefit of the doubt, to explain if I feel like they're doing it without knowing, or to take other measures to hold them accountable through our communities to make sure that this kind of language is not tolerated. I have to say that I do exactly the same when I hear activists repeat Islamophobic tropes as well. A good example is I have been an outspoken activist in Washington, D.C. over the years about selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, especially with violations and war crimes committed by Saudi Arabia with U.S. weapons in Yemen. And I have worked with many activists, very well-meaning activists, who repeat anti-Muslim and Islamophobic tropes while they are fighting against violations in Yemen. And I work with them, and I say these things. I say we can and we should criticize Saudi Arabia and Emirates and other countries who have been committing war crimes in Yemen. We can and we should, but criticizing them for their faith or repeating stereotypes about how like some of the social ills or some of the ill-conceived notions about Muslims in general ends up harming our cause. And the same thing I say about Israel. We are not asking the United States government to suspend military aid to Israel because the majority of Israelis happen to be Jewish. We're not saying, look at these rituals that Israeli Jews do in this settlement, or look how Israeli Jews oppress their women in this settlement and delete their pictures. That is not our argument. It's not our argument. It's not our argument in Saudi Arabia. It is not our argument with Israel. Our argument is also always that there are violations of human rights or U.S. law or international law that are being committed, and that these violations we have to respond to these violations regardless of people's faiths and ethnicity. So to close my answer, yes, I have heard and read actual anti-Semitic language deployed by people who work on Israel-Palestine. You can be anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic at the same time. You can be anti-Zionist and not anti-Semitic. And I think conflating these two is a problem. So denying that people can be anti-Semitic is also a problem. I think we have to face, these problems in our messaging in our communities in a way that is sincere and truthful. To deny that people can be Islamophobic or anti-Semitic or anti-Black is a part of the problem. We have to face the reality that, yes, we do have some voices who also happen to be anti-Semitic and anti-Black and anti-Muslim and but we all have, the burden is on all of us to fight against these voices of discrimination and hatred. The fighting against anti-Semitism does not only fall on our Jewish allies and Jewish American friends. Fighting Islamophobia does not fall on only us Muslim Americans. So I think thinking about all of these things as connected makes the picture more clear. That at the same time that we're fighting for peace and justice in Palestine and Syria and Saudi Arabia and Egypt, that we are fighting against hatred and discrimination such as Islamophobia and anti-Semitism.
I want thank you so much for that, Raed. And it really is a shame when you hear ignorant, unintended anti-Semitic tropes in a statement, when the core of a statement is much more meaningful and it has to do with a relevant topic, and then the focus shifts away from the relevant topic, the point at hand, into this aberration, of a part of a statement that really was innocent in nature, but because of the pervasiveness of these tropes, that becomes the main focus of the entirety of the statement. And I did want to emphasize before I forget that, we're spending a crucial amount of time on focusing on the prefix of these words, anti. It is crucial to point out, and this is not from the political lens, this is more of just a linguistic aspect. When we say Semitic people, when we talk about Semites, it doesn't just encompass the Jewish people, obviously. I'm also a Semitic person as well. So it's not just exclusive to one ethnic group or one racial group. So that I feel is sometimes missed in these discussions. So I want to make sure that that's emphasized. Brant, did you want to say something?
Yeah. Well, that's another distraction in many ways. First of all, Raed, I have to commend you on your powers of concentration. That was truly incredible.
These are my pandemic powers.
The term anti-Semitism, it's in many ways an unfortunate term. The history of it was coined by an anti-Semite, actually, Wilhelm Marr, a German anti-Jew hater, essentially, in the 19th century. And for better or for worse, that term kind of stuck when it came to be the go-to term when we're talking about anti-Jewish hatred. So often the discussion of these issues can get bogged down in, well, aren't these people Semites and aren't those people Semites? Yes, that's all true. But what we're talking about when we're talking about anti-Semitism is specifically hatred directed toward Judaism and the Jewish people. It's an unfortunate fact of history that particular term came to be associated with this, but there we have it. Language often has a life of its own. So that's an important piece to clarify too when we're discussing this issue.
Oh, absolutely. When you add that prefix, yes.
Actually, I do want to say something about that as well, which is, as Tarek points out, actually in the dictionary, the term Semite includes Arabs and Jews and Ethiopians, many people who speak Semitic languages like Arabic, Hebrew, and Amharic. But the term anti-Semite is reserved for anti-Jewish extremism. So, it is interesting that I am also a Semite, and thinking about the historic context of that happens, that it does come from Germany. But here is a caveat that I want to say. And I've heard this defense to minimize accusations of anti-Semitism that might come from people of Arab descent. People say, I am Semitic myself. I'm a Semite. I can't be anti-Semitic. And I actually reject that argument. We actually just heard a similar argument from, in the last few weeks from Vice President Pence, when he said that, defending Trump, he said Trump can't be anti-Semitic because his grandchildren are Jewish. I'm like, you can, you can, and that's something that I feel like absolving an entire community from a charge of, anti-Semitism or some kind of discrimination, just because Arabs happen to be, Semitic, is not a valid point. I have to actually take it one step further to say, I've met many Muslims who are Islamophobic. So it's not really like your genetic background is not necessarily a way to get you out of your responsibilities to pay attention to what you say and understand the impact of what you say. And the last point I want to say, Tarek, is that to respond to what you were saying, that in some cases people make an important point. The spirit of the sentence is important, but then it also includes an anti-Semitic or Islamophobic trope. And I've also heard people try to minimize the impact of Islamophobia or anti-Semitism because it was not the core part of the sentence. I also personally reject those, justifications as well, because I think we have to be responsible for what we say. And although, obviously, we are going to condemn someone who say, I hate all Muslims, kill all Jews. Obviously, that's a very obvious example. But I think when people reiterate historic tropes that are hurtful to Muslims or to Jews or to anyone else, that they have to also take responsibility for their actions. The burden is on them not to say it in the first place, rather than the burden being on the general public to focus on the spirit of the sentence than the destruction. So that's what I'm saying. I do want us to approach the issue in a way that centers our actions, understand that there are voices out there that put us all under a microscope, pick on us, try to accuse us of things that don't really happen. But at the same time, I think we have to take responsibility for our actions and understand that our words have impact.
Responsibility is definitely
I'd like to add a teeny tiny little piece to that. As I was a literature major, and everything that Raed said is absolutely true, and the things that Brant said, and those, without negating any of those things, sometimes I feel like people get too hung up on the fact that, we're Semites too. Like, words have meanings, and over the course of time, many words have changed. We can think of other words that, gay 100 years ago meant happy or cheerful, and now it has a different meaning. And that, so Semites were a whole, much wider group of people, but in common nomenclature, when people use the phrase anti-Semitism, they are speaking about, anti-Jewish bigotry. And I think that when we're talking about the issues of Israel and Palestine, of all the things, the horrible human rights violations, I don't think we should spend too much time getting caught up on the meaning of a word that has changed the common, definition of over time.
Yeah, and actually, I thought we spent too much time already on it. I just wanted to raise the point because it popped up on my screen twice. So I figured, I just want to point that out for our viewers. And I did distinguish between the linguistic element and the political element. So I did make that distinction. So okay, this is more for Brant and Estee. Jewish anti-Zionists get the label sometimes of self-hating Jew because, if targeting Israel is targeting the Jewish collective and they're also Jewish, we can't really pin that label on them. So we just have to say that there's something that they just hate themselves as Jewish people. They hate their Judaism, etc. How do you respond to that ridiculous and unwarranted criticism?
Estee, you want to take a crack at that first?
I'd be happy to, as somebody who is often labeled that way. And not only am I Jewish, my father's family is Israeli. So when people, try to say that I'm self-hating, I mean, I think people just watching us can see, like, we are not people who hate ourselves. But we're also not people who, as Brant said, we're not willing to cover anything up. For Brant, he made a reference to his religion and how his faith brings him to support justice. And for me, it's always been about justice. And this idea that really, when attacking people, it was my experience the moment I became active in this movement, I awoke to find a wanted poster calling me a self-hating Jew. And it was shocking because it seemed so silly. And yet I feel like the only thing people have, it's the same, it's similar to when they call BDS anti-Semitic. Both divestment and sanctions are tools. They're tactics that people use. And boycott happens to be the only one in the hands of all people. Some people are wealthy and they have investments that they can divest from, but most citizens, the way that they can express themselves politically, aside from getting a chance to vote once a year, is where we spend our dollars every day, who we support, who we don't support, and who we withdraw our support from. So this idea of trying to label people who are activists who happen to be Jewish, well, then they must hate themselves or hate their people, or is really just one more of those decisions that we've been talking about. Look over there.
Yeah.
No. Go ahead, Brent, please.
I would just add to that, from time immemorial, there has been intra-Jewish fighting. And the worst thing you can say inside a group is to call someone self-hating. You can talk about internalized anti-Semitism or what have you. I mentioned that for me, I came to the realization that my Jewish faith, my understanding of Jewish values compels me to stand in solidarity with Palestinians. The core teaching of my faith tradition, which is rooted in the lesson that comes from the story of the Exodus, the liberation of the Israelites from Pharaoh, and that God stands with the liberated and against the oppressor. If that's the central sacred mythic story of my religion, then I have to stand with Palestinians. It's not about picking a side. The only sides that really matter are the oppressor and the oppressed. So, for me, it's a pretty straightforward thing. It was not always straightforward. And I think part of that is because in the United States in particular, Zionism and Judaism have become so hopelessly conflated. In almost every synagogue around the country, you'll see an Israeli flag right next to the Aron Kodesh, next to the most sacred direction of prayer in the sanctuary, so that Jews are literally bowing toward not only the Torah, but the Israeli flag. Very recently, there was an event that was termed anti-Semitic. There was a synagogue, I believe it was in Wisconsin, though I'm not 100% sure, that has an Israeli flag out in front of it on a flagpole. And at the bottom of the flagpole, there was the graffiti, "Free Palestine." And people called that anti-Semitic. And to that, I would say, well, this synagogue was making a political statement by putting a nation state's flag in front of its religious edifice. So it was the one that was conflating Israel with all Jews. And I would say the accountability is on those who are conflating, as I said before, a venerable faith tradition with a settler-colonial enterprise.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And, I know we only have a little bit of time left, but I really want to talk about somewhat of a weighty issue in terms of mental gymnastics, how we conceptualize these terms. Recently, Peter Beinart put out a long article in the Jewish Currents and an op-ed in the New York Times. And as I was reading it multiple times, actually, I see him struggling, trying to reconcile his Zionism with his liberal values. And I want you all to speak to that. Liberal Zionists are ferociously against Trump's immigration policy. They are ferociously against the occupation. They oppose much of the domestic liberal agenda that progressive liberals support as well. But when it comes to Israel-Palestine, there we have that exception. We want a two-state solution. We want Palestinians to have a state so we can maintain. I mean, that's the logic of the argument. So we can maintain a Jewish majority. Let's consolidate what we've already conquered. Let's just leave it where it's at right now. Let's not further the Nakba. I'm not saying let's try to restore the rights of the Palestinian people, but let's just take the gains that we have right now and give them just something so that we can just end this conflict and we can preserve Zionism. And he essentially reconciled it in favor of liberalism in that article. So I want you to speak to liberal Zionists. What is your message to them? What do you think? What do you think they're really struggling with? And is it really reconcilable? Is there a strand of Zionism that you can reconcile with a liberal worldview?
No. Speaking as a recovered liberal Zionist, I think I can speak to this. In its origins, I mentioned this before, there were other forms of Zionism other than political Zionism. So, for instance, Hannah Arendt and Martin Buber and Rabbi Judah Magnus called themselves Zionists, but they were strongly against the establishment of a political Jewish state in Palestine. They understood in ways that Peter Beinart wrote, he has actually come around to, understanding Zionism as being rooted in homeland, but not in a political nation state. Can liberalism and political Zionism be reconciled? And the answer is absolutely no. And I'll just give one example of that and turn it over to my friends. For me, the real turning point for me was I really, truly stepped out of myself and listened to what I was saying. And when I used to argue as a liberal Zionist for the two-state solution, the go-to argument, and Beinart has used this argument, and Jeremy Ben-Ami of J Street uses this argument, they use this term called there's a demographic threat, a demographic time bomb, that if the Palestinian non-Jewish birth rate continues, there will be a Jewish minority in that state. And so that was their argument to create a separate Palestinian state alongside a separate Jewish state. And every once in a while, I'd hear myself using this argument and saying, I'm referring to an entire people as a demographic threat. And as a good upstanding liberal, if I used that term for anyone else in this country, that would be just incorrigibly racist. There's no getting around it. There's nothing liberal, quote unquote, about referring to people as a demographic threat, because there's nothing liberal about basing the identity of a country on one demographic group of people. And that's the circle they're never going to square. That's the problem they're never going to be able to solve. And Beinart has been inching toward it. And he's just tentatively broken that open with this article that he wrote. But it's really ultimately a contradiction that can never be resolved. If you're for democracy, you're for democracy for all people, period, end, stop. Everything else is racist as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I think Brant really hit that nail on the head. I come from a slightly different place. Oddly enough, I didn't ever hear the word Zionism growing up. I never heard the word Palestinian or occupation either. But I wasn't taught Zionism because, my father, they didn't speak about that when he was growing up. It just what existed. So for me, I didn't have to undo anything. It was simply the idea that, people would ask, well, what are you going to do? It's an intractable conflict. And my answer was always, well, it seems to me that there is a solution. It's nothing new or modern, and it is radical. I will give you that. It's called democracy. And if you want people to have a buy-in, then they all have to have equal buy-in to make things work.
Yeah. Raed, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I do. And what I want to say is that I am grateful for voices like Estee and Brant and many other Jewish American allies and friends that we have. And I think working with them is also, for me, as someone who did not grow up in the United States and have never had experiences, having friends who are Jewish, where I grew up. I grew up in Iraq and in Jordan and in Saudi Arabia, and there are no Jewish communities there. And for me, it was also an amazing experience to put a human face on Jewish Americans, and after that also on Jewish Israelis, who I have worked with many of them to fight against injustice and the occupation. So it is, I feel like, it's like a full circle for us talking about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, is that for us as communities, speaking about the larger picture ideologies and how we can distinction between them is important, but it is also important to have this human experience, to have allies that we can appreciate and love and work with in a sincere way, not just because we agree on politics, but because we actually appreciate them as humans. And that is something that I want to say today. I feel like, I am thankful to have allies like Brant and Estee and others like JVP and other groups. And it is also an important tool that we have in our toolbox when we have, people who are afraid of Muslims, to see a Muslim face speaking at that synagogue, when we have people who are afraid to collaborate with Jewish Americans, to also have a Jewish voice come to our mosques and our meetings. And this makes a lot of difference and makes us understand how we can work together to oppose injustice in Israel-Palestine without falling in the traps of repeating systems of or supporting systems of oppression and discrimination that are out there.
No, that's absolutely true. That's absolutely necessary. What I find very interesting in our discourse is that we're so focused. I mean, this is a webinar on labels, but we're so focused on labels. But when it's misused, it can really create a mess in terms of how we perceive and conceptualize events on the ground. And when the Israel-Palestine conflict is presented as one between colonizer, colonized, dispossessor, dispossessed, occupier, occupied, when you really illustrate that asymmetry, then I mean, the American people will just gravitate towards the oppressed, but they don't understand it in those terms. And one of the questions posed actually at a J Street conference, one of the questions posed is, hey guys, this is an audience of liberal Zionists. If there is no two-state solution, pretty soon the American people will gravitate towards full equality because that resonates with them. So if Americans are polled, would you want one state, two state, without an explanation of what each one means, and then a third option, full equality for all? They will gravitate to, because it resonates with them living in a democracy. So that's what I find really interesting about the liberal Zionist view, is that I see it as a little more dangerous because it's trying to normalize what Zionism really is. There's a question on the screen. Says, and we're gonna get straight to Q&A. Time is almost up, but we'll do just this one question. Could you comment on the usefulness or not of groups like If Not Now, who do not support BDS or take a stand on Zionism? To what extent do you see them as allies? Whoever.
Estee, do you want to?
No, go for it. I mean, I'm happy to.
Yeah, no. You know, I can't give I guess a definitive answer to that. I think the Jewish community, you know, you mentioned Peter Beinart and how he's been shifting on, you know, dancing on that line for a long time. And one of the things that says to me, and, you know, as someone who was on the other side of that line, is that in the work of liberation, there are many roles to play. And there is sort of what I would call an inside game and an outside game. And I'm unabashedly playing the outside game now. And what I say is pretty much what, you know, Tarek, what you're saying, that really this comes down to oppressor and oppressed. Really what this comes down to is if you believe in democracy for all, you're talking about one state, right? You need to come clean on that. Not every liberal Zionist is ready to take that stand. And I think If Not Now, groups like that, while I find it very frustrating that they don't share that power analysis that I just laid out, at least they're not willing to own that openly. I do think that they are useful in pushing from the inside out. And that is part of the process of liberation that happens as well, that there's a role for everyone to play. So I'm not ready to completely discount groups like them. There aren't that many of them, quite frankly. You know, the Jewish establishment is solidly behind the state of Israel. But if there are groups that are really challenging themselves and trying to push forward toward a stand of equal rights for all and liberation for those who are oppressed, all the better.
I have to say, like a disclaimer first. I've lived in Washington, D.C. for 15 years now, and I was telling a friend this week how, you know, just living in the belly of the beast this long made me a pragmatist. So, like, my standards are much lower. Speaking about double standards,
Washington will do that to you, right?
Exactly. So, with that disclaimer, I would say I do view groups like If Not Now as an ally. You know, I like many of their work. The things that they've been doing, whether it has to do with Israel-Palestine or with immigration, with other forms of racism. And they also respect the process that many of our allies have to go through to get to a closer, you know, point to where we are ideologically, where I am ideologically. I have to say, JVP, I've worked with JVP very, very extremely closely for a long time now, since it was first you know, established in DC. I know JVP has been around for decades, but since it had its, you know, revival and work in DC, JVP wasn't a BDS you know, supporter like once. Like, it wasn't like what it was here in the beginning. It took the JVP a time and a process, and I think I love JVP. They're very close to where I am now. And I feel like they're one of the closest allies, the strongest allies that we have in Washington, D.C., in the Palestine, like for Palestinian, the movement fighting for Palestinian rights. The point that I'm making is that for us as a movement, we can't put very high conditions to consider others allies, because then we will end up pushing them away. And I think we have to open a space up for people who are interested in coordination on any issue that it has to do with Israel-Palestine. Even if we did not agree 100% on the strategy at the beginning, I think opening up the space and working together on limited issues about aid to Israel, or asking for you know, defunding human rights abuses that we're sending with our tax dollars to Israel, or asking for refunding human needs in Palestine, UNRWA and others together. That is also an important experience for to all work together. I think I know as a fact that if not now, also has internal conversations about where they want to head next. I think the same way that we want them to be allies and welcome them to the space, we should also support them in this journey rather than criticize them for not being 100% there. So that's my view. The short answer is yes, I do view, if not now, and other organizations as allies. I think all are welcome to join the movement for fighting for Palestinian rights, fighting for equality, fighting against racism. I don't think any of us is perfect. We can work together to improve our ideological stance and analysis as we work together.
Before I shift it over to Estee, I did want to put a disclaimer out of my own. As a 501c3 nonprofit organization, we do not take a political stance on what solution would be preferable. So I just wanted to point that out there. Estee, I'll let you take it from here. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Brant and Raed really spoke eloquently about that, and I think it's true. I do think that If Not Now plays a role, and they're a young organization, and they will grow and change just like JVP did over the years. So I think having some kind of litmus test would be counterproductive. But I do want to say, as someone who spends a lot of time organizing on campuses prior to COVID and doing legislative advocacy, the one thing that I have found in that world, especially, for me, I'm here in Los Angeles, and the California Democratic Party, which is the largest political organization in the nation, I do hear young activists questioning their elected officials when they're trying to figure out where they stand, and using Palestine as a litmus test of, are you really for equality? Are you really against all forms of oppression and racism? And saying, where are you on this? And they know that they're going to get the real truth here if this person is for real, rising tide raises all boats, or if there is a particular person or a class of people that they are willing to leave out of that equation. And that is what gives me hope for the future, is that the younger activists really see this simply as a human rights issue that must be addressed now.
I really appreciate you mentioning that, Estee, because in my personal view, if there's ever an issue that is black and white in terms of who the oppressor is and who the oppressed is, it is this one. So I think Palestine is a great litmus test to test anybody's human rights values, so on. So and
their political courage.
And their political courage. Absolutely, Brant. Thank you for that. Just last point, please make sure that you save the date on that screen on the bottom. Somebody put it back on there. There it is. ANP's Virtual Palestine Convention, the Thanksgiving weekend, November 27th to the 29th. Please be there on your laptop, iPhone, wherever you are throughout the world. I really want to thank our panelists for joining me in this very important discussion, and for offering your perspectives and for taking the time. I greatly appreciate it. I learned so much. I hope that we can continue to grow, continue to learn, and to continue to fight against racism, whether it's in the form of anti-Semitism or otherwise, and to make sure that we teach our audience to use these terms properly in our political discourse, and to educate accordingly. Thank you all so much. I appreciate your time.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for organizing this.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.